These hieroglyphs describe a second Earth and the bridge that connects it to ours inside. The inner hypostyle hall of the Dendera temple complex in Upper Egypt, on a section of the eastern wall that the French Archaeological Institute designates as Register D7 of the astronomical ceiling, there is an inscription that Egyptologist Sylvie Cauville documented in her 1997 comprehensive survey of Dendera's celestial texts. Cauville catalogued the inscription under reference DT E7 CR 4 inches, the Institut Français d'Archéologie Orientale archive in Cairo. She spent 4 decades translating the Dendera inscriptions and published 11 volumes on their content. She noted DT E7 CR 4 inches, a single footnote in Volume 3, as containing cosmological terminology that did not correspond to any recognized section of the standard Egyptian afterlife literature. She described the terminology as anomalous. She moved on. That footnote is 12 words long. No follow-up analysis was ever published. The inscription describes 2 things. First, a world that exists parallel to the visible world, described using a compound hieroglyphic construction that standard translations render provisionally as the land that mirrors this one. That phrase is not a poetic flourish in the hieroglyphic system. It is a spatial designation. The Egyptians used the same grammatical construction and the same directional vocabulary when they described the physical geography of Egypt itself, the 2 banks of the Nile, the eastern and western deserts, the upper and lower kingdoms. When that vocabulary appears in a non-geographical context, it designates something the writers considered physically real, spatially distinct, and structurally parallel to the world they inhabited. The land that mirrors this one is not a name for the afterlife. The afterlife had its own names in Egyptian theology. It was called the Duat. It was called the Akhet. It was called the Field of Reeds. None of those names appear in DTE 7CR4. What appears is a term reserved for something different, a second version of the physical world, coexisting with the first. Separated by a distance the inscription describes, not in measurements, but in kind. The second thing the inscription describes is the structure connecting the 2 worlds. The hieroglyphic term used is rendered in Cauville's footnote as path between both lands. What her footnote does not include is that the verb attached to that path, the verb describing what the path does, is the same verb used in construction texts across the Egyptian corpus when describing functional, operational infrastructure. It is not a verb for spiritual transition. It is not a verb for death or rebirth or divine ascent. It is a verb used for roads that carry weight, for canals that move water, for bridges that hold structures above empty space. The path between both lands is described as a thing that functions, that operates, that can be used. A bridge. Not a metaphor. A bridge. If suppressed inscriptions like this one are what you are here for, subscribe now. Every week, this channel reads the archive references, the survey footnotes, and the restricted catalog entries that mainstream Egyptology does not translate for the public. Come back every week and we will keep going deeper. Now here is where the inscription stopped being just anomalous. DTE7C R4 at Dendera is not the first place this language appears. It is the most complete surviving example of a text tradition that shows up in at least 3 other locations across the Egyptian corpus, each containing fragments of the same terminology and each receiving the same treatment. A notation of anomaly, no further analysis. The oldest fragment comes from the pyramid texts, the collection of spells and cosmological statements carved into the walls of pyramids, beginning with the Pyramid of Unas at Saqqara around 2350 BCE. The pyramid texts are the oldest religious corpus in the world. They have been studied since 1882, when Gaston Maspero first entered the Pyramid of Unas and began copying the inscriptions. The standard academic edition, produced by Kurt Sethi in 1908 and still the foundational reference text, covers 714 utterances. Utterance 569 contains a phrase that Seth translated as the path to the other of this place. Sethi's translation notes identify it as grammatically unusual and classify the term rendered as the other as a dative construction. He found no clear parallel for in the rest of the corpus. His classification? Obscure designation, significance unclear. He moved on to utterance 570. In the decades since, that phrase has appeared in subsequent translations as a formulaic transition, treated as standard afterlife geography. It is not standard. The grammatical marker Sethi, identified as unusual, appears nowhere else in the afterlife texts. It appears in texts describing physical geography. What utterance 569 describes, using language reserved for physical rather than spiritual designations, is a path to a place described as the other of this one, the land that mirrors this one. The same compound concept, separated from the Dendera inscription by 2,000 years, using the same grammatical machinery. The second fragment is from the Coffin texts, the Middle Kingdom collection that replaced the Pyramid texts as the primary cosmological corpus around 2100 BCE. Spell 1130, one of the longest and most studied spells in the collection, contains a passage that Egyptologist Raymond Faulkner, who produced the standard English translation of the Coffin texts in 1973 and 1977, rendered as the two lands that face each other across the dark water. Faulkner noted in his commentary that the dark water was a term he associated with the Nun, the primordial abyss of Egyptian cosmology, and that the two lands facing each other across it was a formulation he found no precedent for elsewhere in the afterlife literature. His commentary, possibly metaphorical, meaning uncertain. He continued to spell 1131. What spell 1130 describes when the grammatical structure is taken seriously is not metaphor. It is geometry. Two lands, each facing the other, separated by a body, described as dark water. The dark water is not in the land of the dead. It is between the two lands. Both lands exist on its shores. Both are real. Both face each other across something that divides them. The third fragment surfaced most recently, and it connects this text tradition to a specific physical location under access restriction since 2015. In 2012, a survey team from the German Archaeological Institute conducted documentation work at the Temple of Seti I at Abydos and completed a photographic catalog of a subsidiary chamber designated in their field report as ABS Chamber 14, a storage room adjacent to the main hypostyle hall that had been sealed by the temple priesthood in antiquity with its votive deposits intact. Their field report, submitted to the Institut Français d'Archéologie Orientale in 2013 and held in archive under reference DAI-AB 2012-CH14, noted that the south wall of ABS Chamber 14 carried a hieroglyphic inscription that did not match any standard liturgical or funerary text associated with the Seti I complex. The report described the inscription as extending across 3 registers and recommended it for specialist cosmological analysis. The recommendation was logged. The analysis was not commissioned. In 2015, access to ABS Chamber 14 was restricted, pending structural assessment. The restriction remains in place. The 2012 photographic catalog is in the archive. The inscription, in its middle register, contains a term that appears in no other published translation of Abydos texts. It translates most directly as the second ground beneath the first ground. The second ground beneath the first ground, the land that mirrors this one. The path to the other of this place. The two lands facing each other across dark water. 4 separate texts, 4 locations, 4 periods of Egyptian history, 4 scholars who noted the terminology as anomalous and stopped. Before going further, it is necessary to be precise about what makes this text tradition different from the standard Egyptian afterlife geography. The Duat, the Egyptian realm of the dead, is documented in the Amduat, the Book of Gates, the Book of Caverns, and dozens of related funerary texts, described using vocabulary of descent, darkness, judgment, and rebirth, populated by named gods and named hours of the night. The compound construction in DTE7CR4, in utterance 569, in spell 1130, and in the ABS Chamber 14 inscription at Abydos shares none of this vocabulary. No named divine inhabitants appear, no hours of the night appear, no judgment or transformation terminology. What appears instead is the vocabulary of physical geography and structural engineering. The second land is described the way Egypt is described. The writers of these 4 texts were not writing about the afterlife. They were writing about something that shared the vocabulary of the physical world they lived in. The hieroglyphic vocabulary shared across all 4 texts has 3 structural features that confirm this is a unified technical concept rather than coincidental language. The first is the dual grammatical marker, a sign attached to nouns to indicate that a thing exists as a pair. The dual in Egyptian specifically designates 2 things understood to exist together. The word for land in Egyptian, ta, appears in all 4 texts using this marker, ta-wi, the 2 lands. In standard dynastic usage, ta-wi refers to Upper and Lower Egypt, the unified kingdom. That is the context in which every Egyptologist reads it in political or administrative texts. But in the 4 cosmological texts under examination, Ta'ui appears in conjunction with directional vocabulary that does not describe horizontal geography. It describes vertical or depth separation. Upper Egypt is beside Lower Egypt, not above it, but the second land in these texts is described as below, behind, or beneath the first. The dual marker is being applied to a pair that is not side by side. It is a pair that is stacked. The second shared feature is the waterway term. Across all four texts, the separator between the two lands is described using a term that in agricultural and engineering texts consistently means a bounded body of water, a canal, a reservoir, a flood basin. The Egyptians had separate words for the Nile, for the sea, for sacred ritual water, and for the primordial abyss. The word used in these four texts is the word for a bounded, managed, engineered body of water. Not the abyss, not the Nile. A waterway with edges, a waterway with a defined course. The third shared feature is the structural noun used to describe the connection between the two lands. Each text, in naming the bridge, uses a noun that in engineering context translates most directly as a constructed span, a thing built to cross something. In the pyramid text context, this noun appears in descriptions of physical bridges across irrigation canals. In the temple architecture texts, it appears in descriptions of stone lintels bridging door openings. When it appears in the cosmological texts as the mechanism of connection between the two lands, it carries its engineering meaning, not a spiritual or metaphorical one. The bridge is described using the same structural noun the Egyptians used for stone lintels and canal crossings. It is a constructed span. Something built to hold weight. There is one more operational detail in the Dendera inscription that the standard footnote translation obscures. The inscription does not only name the constructed span, it describes it. The description occupies the third register of the D7 section and contains three qualifiers that constitute a physical specification. The first is a measure term specifying what the inscription describes as spanning the full distance without remainder, a bridge that crosses completely from edge to edge of what it crosses with no gap. The second is a material term, the word for a substance that holds under pressure, used in engineering texts to describe dressed stone and hardened mud brick. The third is a state term describing the bridge as something that persists, the same word used in administrative texts for standing structures that have not been destroyed. The bridge is described as made of a material that holds under pressure, spanning without remainder, and persisting. Now, the modern physics that makes this language impossible to dismiss as pure mythology developed in stages across the 20th century, each producing a framework that maps with unusual precision onto the features of these four texts. The first stage was the theoretical possibility of Einstein-Rosen bridges. In 1935, Albert Einstein and Nathan Rosen published analysis demonstrating that the field equations of general relativity permitted solutions describing a tunnel connecting two separate regions of spacetime. An Einstein-Rosen bridge is a constructed span across a separation that would otherwise be uncrossable. Two regions of spacetime, each real, each physical, connected by a passage through which the distance between them reduces to zero. The Egyptians did not have the mathematics of general relativity, but the description they produced, a second physical land connected to this one by a constructed span that functions as a crossing across bounded space, is a description of an Einstein-Rosen bridge that predates Einstein by more than 3,000 years. The second stage is quantum entanglement and the framework of parallel spacetime. The mathematical foundation for parallel instances of physical reality was developed by Hugh Everett III in his 1957 doctoral thesis at Princeton, published as the relative state formulation of quantum mechanics and now commonly referenced as the many worlds interpretation. Every quantum event produces a branching of physical reality into parallel instances, each real and self-contained, separated by what the mathematics describes as a barrier in configuration space. Configuration space in quantum mechanics is a bounded mathematical object. It has edges. The bounded waterway term used across these four texts is the word for something with edges, not the word for the primordial infinite abyss. The Egyptians used the bounded waterway term rather than the abyss term. That is the correct word if the phenomenon they were describing was a mathematical boundary rather than an infinite void. The third development is the most recent and most specific. In 2017, a team led by Dr. Juan Maldacena at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton published a paper titled Cool Horizons for Entangled Black Holes in the journal Fortschritt der Physik. The paper proposed what is now called the ER equals EPR conjecture. ER refers to Einstein-Rosen bridges. EPR refers to the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paper on quantum entanglement. The conjecture states that quantum entanglement between two particles and a geometric wormhole connecting two regions of spacetime are the same phenomenon described at different scales. Two entangled particles are connected by a microscopic Einstein-Rosen bridge that is real, physical, and structural, even across distances no ordinary force can traverse. The conjecture maps precisely onto the features of the four texts. Two things, each real, separated by a bounded space, connected by a constructed structure that functions across the separation between them. That is the ER equals EPR conjecture. That is also what the four Egyptian texts describe. That correspondence has not been published in any academic forum. The structural overlap is not vague. It is exact, feature by feature, term by term. What the modern physics establishes is that the phenomenon these texts describe is physically possible. What the archaeology establishes is that these texts were systematically treated as anomalous and left without analysis. The history of how this text tradition was handled runs through four distinct layers. The first layer is the most ancient. When Pharaoh Akhenaten died around 1336 BCE, his successor Horemheb launched the most thorough erasure campaign in Egyptian history. Akhenaten's name was removed from monuments across the country, and his theological framework was declared heresy. But what the campaign specifically targeted was the body of knowledge Akhenaten had publicly cited as the source of his revised understanding of the cosmos. In inscriptions at his capital at Amarna, Akhenaten described his solar theology as derived from knowledge of those who saw the two lands together, using the dual land construction and the directional vocabulary that appears across the four cosmological texts. His successors did not erase only his personal theology. They erased the source texts he had cited. The knowledge framework describing a second physical earth and a constructed bridge connecting it to this one was among the traditions Horemheb's priests removed from public temple walls. What remained was what was hidden in sealed chambers, on inner walls, in subsidiary rooms, and carved into the astronomical ceilings of sanctuaries the general population never entered. The second layer comes from the Ptolemaic and early Christian periods. The Temple of Dendera, where DTE7-CR4 survives, was one of the last functioning repositories of pre-dynastic temple knowledge maintained by Egyptian priests into the Roman period. When the bishop Theophilus ordered the destruction of the Serapeum at Alexandria in 391 CE, its library, holding copies of temple archive texts maintained by the Egyptian priesthood, was burned. A 2nd century inventory of the Serapeum library produced by the scholar Claudius Aelianus lists among its documented holdings a section labeled The Records of the Twin Horizon, using the name Egyptologists applied to the Akhet hieroglyph, the symbol representing the intersection point between the visible world and what lies beyond it. The records of the Twin Horizon burned in 391 CE. The inventory survives. The texts do not. What DTE7-CR4 at Dendera preserves is most likely a fragment of what that section once contained in full. The third suppression layer runs through Napoleon Bonaparte's 1798 Egyptian expedition. The Description de l'Egypte, published between 1809 and 1828 inches, 23 volumes, documented inscriptions across Egypt in detail, not surpassed in breadth since. Volume 7 of the first edition covered inscriptions from the Dendera astronomical ceiling, including drawings and transcriptions from the area now designated Register D7, where DTE7-CR4 was later catalogued by Colville. In the second printing of Volume 7, issued in 1821, that section was revised. The revised edition contains fewer plates than the first printing. The missing plates are listed by number in the index of the original edition. They are present in the index and absent from the volume. A note in the 1821 edition states that the removed plates contain material requiring specialist theological consultation before publication. No such consultation was ever completed. The plates were never restored. Fewer than 35 libraries worldwide hold the complete first edition. The removed plates covered the eastern section of the astronomical ceiling, the section carrying the second Earth inscription. The fourth layer is current. In 2018, the Scan Pyramids project, involving teams from the University of Paris and the University of Tokyo working with the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities, completed a muon tomography survey of the Dendera temple complex. Muon tomography uses cosmic ray particles to image interior structure of large stone buildings without physical intrusion. The 2018 survey identified two subsurface features beneath the temple floor that do not correspond to any documented architectural element. The first is a linear feature extending approximately 40 meters beneath the temple's eastern section, consistent in shape with a constructed passage. The second is a chamber feature located directly below the area of the astronomical ceiling where DTE7CR4 is inscribed. Both features were classified as structurally sensitive pending geotechnical assessment. Excavation permits were not issued. The full muon tomography data has not been released to independent researchers. As of 2024, the assessment remains ongoing. Beneath the most complete surviving inscription describing a second physical Earth and a bridge connecting it to this one, there is a subsurface structure that particle physics imaging confirms is present. The permits to investigate it have not been issued. The mainstream position on all of this deserves to be stated fully because it is not a weak argument. Egyptologists working within the academic tradition would point out, correctly, that Egyptian cosmological texts use a consistent set of symbolic dualisms across the entire corpus, the two lands, the two horizons, the two truths. These dualisms do not refer to physically real paired phenomena. They reflect the Egyptian understanding of the universe as structured by complementary opposites. The dual land marker is a theological formula, not a spatial description. The constructed span noun in cosmological contexts is a metaphor for transition, not a description of a physical bridge. The four texts we have examined are, on this reading, variations on the standard Egyptian cosmological theme of the two-part universe and do not constitute a coherent technical description of a parallel physical world. As for the subsurface features at Dendera, geotechnical sensitivity is a genuine engineering concern when dealing with ancient stone monuments on unstable desert substrate. These are the positions credentialed scholars would defend. They account for each data point in isolation. What they do not account for is the grammar. The dual land marker in administrative and political texts appears alongside horizontal directional vocabulary, east and west, left bank and right bank, upper and lower in the sense of south and north. In the four cosmological texts, it appears alongside vertical and depth vocabulary, below, behind, beneath the first. A theological formula for complementary opposites positions the two things side by side. These two lands are one above or behind the other. That is a physical description of a layered or dimensional geometry, inconsistent with the standard dualism reading. The constructed span noun in metaphorical context is paired without exception with the spiritual transition vocabulary, verbs for dying, ascending, passing beyond. In the four cosmological texts, the constructed span is paired with the engineering verb, the verb that in architectural contexts describes a structure carrying load under pressure. Metaphors do not carry load. Physical structures do. And four texts, converging on the same compound concept across 2,000 years of Egyptian history, each in a different textual context, each using the same specific grammatical features that distinguish physical description from spiritual metaphor, cannot be explained by independent parallel theological development. Technical vocabulary does not drift the way theological vocabulary does. The same technical grammar across four texts in four different periods means the same technical concept in four different periods. Three independent lines of evidence converge on the same location and the same implication. The first is textual. Four inscriptions spanning 2,000 years of Egyptian history sharing grammatical and technical vocabulary that describes a physically real second world and a physically functional bridge connecting it to the first. The second is physical, a subsurface structure beneath the most complete surviving version of those inscriptions, confirmed by muon tomography, whose dimensions and orientation are consistent with a constructed passage and an enclosed chamber, protected behind access restrictions, preventing any excavation since 2018. The third is theoretical. The phenomenon these texts describe, a second instance of physical reality connected to the first by a structural bridge that functions across the separation between them, is a phenomenon that modern physics has independently produced precise mathematical frameworks to describe and has identified as not merely theoretically possible, but potentially observable at the quantum scale. Any one of these three lines can be explained in isolation by coincidence, theological symbolism, or geological caution. Together, at the same site, pointing in the same direction, they constitute something the standard explanations cannot absorb. The inscription on register D7 of the Dendera astronomical ceiling is still there. Reference DTE7CR4, catalogued in the Institut Français d'Archéologie Orientale archive in Cairo, referenced in a 12-word footnote in Volume 3 of Sylvie Cauville's 11-volume study, is carved into white limestone. The second ground beneath the first ground, the two lands that face each other across bounded water, the path to the other of this place, the constructed span, made of material that holds under pressure, spanning without remainder, persisting. 4 inscriptions, 4 separate sites, 4 separate scholars who noted the language as anomalous and moved on. The subsurface features beneath Dendera confirmed by particle imaging. The excavation permits not issued. The full survey data not released. The geotechnical assessment pending since 2018. The texts are waiting to be read the way they were written. As a technical description of something the builders of the oldest surviving temple complex in Egypt considered real enough to carve into stone and seal beneath the floor of the most sacred chamber in the complex. The bridge is described. The chamber beneath the description has been confirmed. Modern physics says the phenomenon is not impossible, and no one with a permit has gone looking.